Right, here we go. Right, so Jack Airey, you are the research fellow at Policy Exchange, and you are responsible for the Building Beautiful documentation and all things housing related.
Yeah, so I lead the work at Hatton Housing, yeah.
Yeah, so that was first published back in June, was it June last year?
Yeah, June 2018.
And what was it that brought that about? Like, who initiated the project initially?
Good question. It's the way think tanks work is you think of an idea and you think this is something that's going to be interesting, that's relevant to government policy. We saw that one cause of NIMBYism is the way that things look, whether new developments look. We're interested in how do you build 300,000 homes a year? Thinking, okay, what the government it provides money for infrastructure, it sets legal obligations on affordable housing. These are two things that people think about in terms of why they might object to a development in their area. And another one we thought is the design of stuff. Like, a lot of people don't like what new developments look like in their neighborhood. So if we can ask the public, what we thought was we're going to ask the public, what do they want? What would they want in developments? What kind of things would they support? Is that actually important to them at all? Maybe it isn't. We just thought, okay, let's do some research on this. Let's see how it can be relevant to government policy, what it could do, and we went from there. There wasn't some grand plan with it. There never is with a kind of think tank report. We just did some research over a few months. We did a poll of 5,013 people, I think, by a polling company called Delta Poll. They also did four focus groups for us. One was with older people, one was with younger people, one was with architects, and one was with planners. So they were 2-hour sessions just talking about all things design and style. Why do homes look the way they do? What kind of power do architects think they have to change things? What power do planners think they have to change things? Where do they think it all lies? How does the process happen? And then with the ones with the citizens, members of the public, not the architects and planners aren't, but just generally asking about these things. It was just good to explore further in detail. What would they like? What are the things that they like about their home? What would they want someone else's? Or not? What would they want other homes in their neighborhood to look like? You by asking these kind of questions, you dig down, you just dig deeper on what people actually want and what they'd be willing to accept in their neighborhood. Because while it's true, some people will just object to the fact of development in their area. Most people are very reasonable on when it comes to this question, especially with the need for much greater house building, especially in London and the southeast. People accept that, and whether they're the older people, even though most people think the old people are the biggest NIMBYs, they're not always, because they see their grandchildren they're not being able to afford a home or paying far too much for rent, and they accept that some things have got to change and that might change in their neighborhood. So if you accept that premise, which we did, which I think quite a few people did, but some people don't, we just thought, okay, well, let's explore that a bit deeper.
Yeah, well, that it is an interesting premise, because this is one of the things that I still haven't sort of settled on myself, is to what degree should the public have direct, indirect, or no control over what is built. And the mechanisms as they exist at the moment obviously go via the planning system. But is there, do you think, a potential for a greater role for people to have direct involvement in deciding what is built in their local area, or how it's designed, or what it looks like?
I think anything that brings greater certainty to the planning process is a good thing to start with. So if you can, I'm not sure how it would happen, but if you can get young people, old people, all parts of society speaking to a local authority in somewhere, or local authority planning department in some way or another, about what they would like, what they would support, what they don't want, what they find ugly, what they find beautiful, that would be great. So from there, you could write design code, you could write the local plan. And I know these processes happen to an extent already. So in some places, in some local authority areas, engagement with the public is actually very good. In some, it's really quite bad. So yes, I think the more the better. You don't want to go all the way. You don't want people to homeowners. And I'm only speaking about homeowners here. They own the property rights to the red line around their home. They don't own the property rights to their whole village. They don't get to say, they don't own the property rights to the field that they have a nice view onto. That's not how it works. However, you've got to accept that their views matter, and they have important things to say about how their village or town or city might grow. And it's good to ask them this. And to the extent, it's worth asking, what in what way can the public get involved already? So I think most people. I mean, I've actually been to a few planning committees because of my role, what I do. I have to go and listen to them, and they're tawdry and boring affairs, but they're very interesting because I think most people don't get engaged, but they just think they rely on their local councillor to represent them or whoever's on the planning committee. And if you listen, I mean, if you look at the makeup of local government planning committees, they look nothing like the population. They tend to be old people who, there's nothing wrong with that, but they have a lot of time on their hands and they are able to do these things. And the people that attend the planning committees also tend to be a bit older too. They don't tend to look like society. So we're getting a small part of society that are engaging in this to begin with. And I think people just rely on their local councillor to put their views. And there's very little electoral gain for a councillor in supporting new housing. There's a lot to be won in opposing it. And that is the biggest, that's one of the things we wanted to look at in the report, really.
Yeah. Do you think, have you sort of had some sort of a kind of a rude awakening to the world of the style wars as they used to be, and the world of architecture versus politics and all this sort of thing since you've been involved in this topic?
Yes.
Sure.
I think policy exchange, not necessarily me. I have been described as fascistic, which is very interesting. We have been compared to, the things we've said have been compared to Albert Speer, so Hitler's advisor. We have been we've been talked about just advancing agendas of old white men, which is a very odd thing if you look in our office. So yes, it's been felt the full throttle of some parts of the architectural community, and kind of I knew it existed, but I was kind of taken aback by the reaction of some people to some of the stuff that we're saying. And I think I mean we're great. We did this to provoke a debate. That's what we want. We're a think tank. That's what we do. But in terms of provoking a debate, we wanted politicians to think about this. So think tanks straddle policy and politics, and there are some people that will talk about the quality of new housing development and the beauty of new housing development, but not enough. And we didn't think politicians talked about this enough, to the extent that it's important to society. So, I mean, I think that's what think tanks are there for. Yeah,
well, I think it's absolutely great that this is back on the agenda in terms of political discussion, at least. Although the sort of the more cynical part of me thinks that, is it sort of a distraction or an intent to make it look like something is being done rather than actually an intent to do something? Were I to be completely cynical about the sort of political intent behind it,
I would vehemently disagree. I think it's completely opposite. And people are willing to I accept people disagree with the proposition that if you make housing more beautiful as the public think of beauty, they're more likely to say yes or no, or sorry, you're more likely to support new housing in the development. It's fine to disagree with that, and we're not. And I suppose I'm not going to speak on behalf of the government, but we, as in Policy Exchange, have never said that this will entirely solve the housing crisis. I would be out of a job if we solved the housing crisis. I have to find other ways to do it too. It's just one part of it. It's the same, as I said earlier. It's the same way we think about how can we spend more money on infrastructure, or providing new schools or new hospitals that make a development work and that make people support a new development, or setting in London we have I think it's 45% target for affordable housing. So the same way we think about that, about making development acceptable, we thought design and style is something else in that, and it was always focused towards that. And so, sorry, going back to your question, it's definitely not. It's not a decoy, to use the term that Roger Scruton used. It's about breaking down the why people are NIMBYs, and government coming up with a solution to that. I don't know what that solution is yet. I mean, we'll get on to talking about that, I'm sure.
I'm increasingly skeptical about this idea that suddenly if you make all developments sort of beautiful or more attractive, that suddenly millions more of them are going to sail through planning and our entire housing crisis will be solved. I think it's almost a false premise that the kind of the whole thing is founded upon, and it's, for me, I think that the solutions lie in other places. But do you think that there is any truth in the idea that suddenly planning applications would increase if buildings are made more attractive?
If more planning applications increase, I think if we had greater certainty on what the public like, or what the local public like, and if developers can respond to that, or the public sector can respond to that, then yes, I think the planning process becomes less adversarial and easier. I don't know if people would submit more planning applications. I guess it depends how much land government allows forward for development, or local authorities come forward for development. But I think the point of it being less adversarial is really important, because so much money is wasted on the planning system. It's like the planning system, it's like this false industry where like one local authority will pay a consultant to write its local plan, and it takes so many years. So there are some local authorities that don't have it. Like I think 60% of local planning authorities don't have in place a local plan, and they've had so long to do it. And it shows how difficult it is to do this thing. But the whole industry is not working, and so if we can spend less money on consultants advising local authorities on local plans, and developers spending less on consultants trying to navigate the planning, telling them how they can navigate the planning system by just having greater certainty on it through asking people what they find beautiful, then yes, I do think it become easier. I don't know if we'll get more planning applications. There are other factors at play for that, in terms of, do we release some land around here or around the green belt or anything like that? That would attract more planning applications.
Well, this is what I mean. Like, the vast majority of planning applications go through in the normal time, whatever, 8 to 12 weeks or whatever it is. And so the idea that they're going to suddenly speed up is probably not going to happen. But like you say, whether or not more will go in is probably unlikely. And I'm obviously, as an architect myself, I'm all for buildings being more attractive, whatever that means. But I think there is this sort of this false idea of linking beauty and attractiveness as one perfectly legitimate agenda to housing numbers, which is another perfectly legitimate agenda. And I think that there's people, especially politicians, and perhaps especially the housing minister, thinks that there's more of a link there than maybe there is.
I don't know how big the link is. I do think there's a link there. And mainly because to solve the housing crisis, whatever that might be, we do need to release more land for development where people most want to live, where most people most want to live. Where's housing demand highest? It tends to be in London and the southeast. There's this big donut of land around London which we are not allowed to build on, and that's normally for very good reasons. But there's a lot of land there that is kind of, I think we call it like non-green green belt. Except like convincing people that we should build on that land is very difficult. But convincing people that we should build on the edge of their village, or the edge of their town, is very difficult. If we're going to win that argument, I say we, the local authority or the government, that we should be doing this. Yes, as I said, one part, infrastructure, affordable housing, and it's going to look quite good. It's going to add to the value of your area. And I think the argument, NIMBYs get a bad rap, but the heart of their argument is actually true. It's like they don't want their property price to the value of their property to be impacted by new development. And if most new development is impacting that, or if it's taking away from the aesthetic value of their place, then I think it's fine. It's reasonable to object to that new development. So if we can again drill down into why people are NIMBYs, then it's a good way of creating a better system which will more homes and people more accepting to let the land on the edge of their city be built on. A lot of outer London, so I'm focusing on London here, but a lot of outer London's quite ugly. If we can if we can make the argument that actually we're going to release that very ugly field that's environmentally very poor, currently used for farming or for a golf course or for ponies, actually that's not a very good use of that land. And the people in London, the 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds who really need a home would actually quite like to live in a home on that plot of land. And we're actually going to release that land, and we're going to build on it in a beautiful way that you like, that adds jobs to the area, that adds vibrancy to the area, hospitals, schools, and it just makes it a nicer place. Then that flips the argument somewhat, and I suppose that's our agenda. Policy Exchange's agenda in this regard is how do we make housing development more popular, or at least less opposed.
Yeah, I think you're right to sort of mention NIMBYs generally. I think NIMBYs do get a bad rap in that I'd say it's perfectly legitimate for somebody to, although it is hypocritical, I think it's perfectly legitimate for someone to say, move into a brand new build house on the outskirts of a town, and then oppose the next phase of the development that's going to be built next to their house. Like, obviously it's hypocritical, but I don't think we should necessarily blame people for sort of looking out for their own interests effectively. Although it is kind of a selfish attitude, but again, I don't think we should blame people for having that. But again, I'd sort of draw a distinction between the urban planning and placemaking, I suppose, aspects of this, of having good schools in places and having vibrant town centres and all these sorts of things, and the aesthetics of the actual buildings that are constructed. And the sort of the link between those, these are issues that are very easily or very often confused and tangled up together. And I with the sort of the polling that you did as well, and I think I mentioned this in the piece that I wrote for your latest document, that it's very difficult to untangle the different factors at play and the different variables. So how do you think we can move forward to try and untangle some of those things, to find out how much of good development that people like is about placemaking and that kind of thing and urban planning related things, and how much of it is actually about aesthetics?
My guess is aesthetics is one part of this, and in our original document, I think this is the point that we tried to make as well. Just say, like, we never in the argument we're making, we're never trying to say, you know, there's only one style of architecture that is good, one style of architecture that is bad. It was more just ask. We never felt like the people actually asked what they like. We did that, and we found some results. And it showed there was quite people have a varied view of what they want. And in terms of drilling down in exactly what people want, I think that's actually best answered by an architect like yourself, like you do in your essay. But yes, it's just. Our starting proposition was, if you walk around a lot of new housing estates, new developments across the country, you don't get the sense that these are going to be, to use the housing minister's phrase, the conservation areas of the future. Like, again, I am not an architect. I am in no way trained that way, but I can walk around and tell they're not very well designed. You know, you have homes that don't, like, you walk along the road and the homes, you see like a big wall rather than the front of someone's house. You don't get streets. You can feel that everything's kind of just plotted randomly to maximize the number of homes that have been built there rather than to create a place. Aesthetics is one part of that. And again, like, you walk around and you look at the homes and they're these kind of faux Georgian, faux Victorian, designed by numbers kind of homes, and they don't fill you with a sense of joy, and maybe in 30 years they will. I don't know, but that's the starting proposition. You walk around a place and you think, this is not adding to the value of the wider area yet. Okay, what can we do about that? Who's to blame? Whose fault is that? Maybe it's no one's fault, but maybe there are certain things that government can do through the planning system, through what it spends in subsidies, through things like Help to Buy. I mean, we've seen with the Persimmon news earlier in the week, government are threatening to withhold Help to Buy from homes built by Persimmon because of the quality of what is built and the kind of the working culture in the organisation. So there are lots of things government can do and local authorities can do, and then also that architects and planners and developers can do to raise the standards of new building in this country. And I think more generally, I say architects there. I say politics as if we're all powerful. We went into this agenda or into this debate with the intention we want more architects involved in house building. Something like only 8% of new build homes go through an architect's studio, and I mean that's never going to get to 100%, nor would it need to. But it's quite a depressingly low figure in my opinion. So how do we get more architects working in volume house building? Because if it's not, it's not the most inspiring of new development at the moment. And how do you get more architects more involved?
Well, there are, as I'm sure you know, there are some very enlightened developers who sort of see the value of good architectural engagement and hire the best architects to engage and do that. But I think that this is one area where sort of the architectural establishment and the profession can definitely agree with yourselves and with politicians maybe to some extent, that the role of the architect has shifted over however many decades it's been. And the architects are increasingly talking about being marginalized and having a lesser and lesser role, and being just one of many consultants, and being sort of contracted out, and being under the thumb of the developer in design and build contracts. And I think that's where potentially there's a political intervention that could make a massive difference. For example, after the Grenfell thing, I attended one event at the RABA, and there was a guy there who was a lawyer, I can't remember his name, but he was saying that the banks would not lend to any developer who was doing anything other than a design and build contract, that you had to have a design and build contract, and that will always inevitably lead to lower quality, effectively. And going back more than 100 years, it used to be that the architect was effectively the master builder. There was no such thing as the main contractor. The main contractor didn't exist, and you had the architect was effectively the project manager, and was responsible ultimately for the entire building and its delivery. And if there is some interventions to be made politically, then I think the most effective level they can be made at is in terms of reorganizing the sort of the power hierarchy, if you like, back towards the architect. And obviously I would say that because I'm an architect, but perhaps there isn't quite as much of an understanding amongst developers and lenders and politicians as to how much of a difference it makes when you've got an architect who's ultimately responsible for the entire project, rather than just a consultant along with all the others.
Yeah, let architects be architects, let planners be planners. Like, we need to make these industries far more relevant to house building today in the contemporary sense.
Well, the trouble is that, of course, there's good architects and bad architects, and there have been throughout history. And it will almost certainly be the case that within your big developer who builds your shoddy houses, that they will have a qualified architect who delivers the buildings and draws up the buildings, but maybe isn't very good at their job. So exactly how you sort of work out the mechanisms around that might be quite difficult. But I think this is where the sort of the design guides and I suppose the planning system as well does come in.
And these are all issues the commission has been. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission.
Even you've forgotten the name now.
That's why it's been set up. It's to ask these questions like, how can government change this? What can we do for lenders? What can builders do? Do developers want to change? Are they actually quite open to this idea? And how can consumer behaviour change? How will it change in the next few years? If house prices aren't going to rise as quickly in the next few decades, and they're quite unlikely to, then how do buying attitudes or renting attitudes change? Maybe people actually will care more about what it looks like or what it's like inside, how it's been designed. Because this is a generalization, but I think it's fair to say most first-time buyers in this country, they have so much pressure to get onto they want to get onto the housing ladder so much that they don't have that much choice to be able to choose between the house, their dream house, the one that they want, that they'd like their home to look like, and what's on offer. I think Ben Derbyshire, president of REBA, in his essay for our recent collection, described it as like a Hobson's choice. So I think, how do we have more variety in the housing sector, more modernist housing, more contemporary housing, more genuine Victorian styled housing, or brutalist housing, whatever you like, whatever the people want, we should build. What we have at the moment is just a lack of choice. And if the Commission can find ways for this the way that the industry works at the moment, which is almost entirely driven by profit, to change, then, or in the private sector, then that would be a good thing.
Well, in terms of sort of non-profit oriented building, then local authorities, local authority house building dropped off in the 1980s for obviously a number of reasons. And I mean, you just have to look at the graphs to see that the shortfall effectively lies there, if anywhere. How can particularly a Conservative government bring about more local authority house building in a way that will be politically palatable and sort of workable and sustainable in the long term, do you think?
I think it's worth saying that some of the best new homes are now built by recently built homes are built by local authorities or commissioned by local authorities. So those are schemes in Hackney and Islington at the moment. They look amazing. And you think, okay, if the public sector are doing it that well or commissioning that well, then why is what we build in the private sector of a lower standard or a lower beauty? In terms of how to get more local authorities to build homes, I mean, yes, everyone agrees that almost everyone agrees that it's a good idea. As you said, they used to build around 100,000 homes a year, or between 50 and 100,000 homes a year. And to be honest, a lot of what is built, after the war, it needs to be replaced. It needs to, it wasn't meant to last longer than 30 years. There are about 3,000 estates around London that were built after the war, which are either they almost need to, it's very politically difficult to say this, but they need to be knocked down and rebuilt in a much better quality, in much better design, in ways that people like. But the problem is that people live there and it's their home, and you can't just knock down someone's home. It's a very difficult issue. So I think we should temper this argument about more local authority building by the quality of what's gone before, and the need to focus on regenerating that stock, particularly because a lot of it is in very high value locations. We should absolutely be looking at how we can rebuild that housing in a way that houses the people that are there and more people. We can provide more social housing. And there are a lot of schemes across London that already do this. It's just the politics are utterly fraught. And we actually have an essay on this by Zach Goldsmith in our essay collection, who obviously failed in his London mayoral election. What was it, 2016? And it's an issue. I don't think it's an issue that's gone away, but it's not really talked about too much. But back to local authorities. So at the moment, local authorities build about 1,000 to 2,000 homes a year in England, yes, we want that to go up, but the idea of it going up to 10,000 or even 50,000 in the next few years is it's not going to happen. Mainly because the way that local authorities finance new council homes is through their housing revenue account. To have a housing revenue account, you need to own, a local authority needs to own stock. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, around 2/3 of all local authorities have transferred their stock to housing associations. Therefore, most of the 2/3 of local authorities don't have any housing stock to borrow against. So it's
So they're only allowed to use their existing housing stock as the financial base for building more housing.
That's the main way of funding new council homes. Yes. Okay. So therefore. So we're starting at that position. So most local authorities don't have the access to finance at the moment, but there are ways around that, and government could do stuff around that, but they're not at the moment. But there used to be a cap on how much local authorities can borrow since 2011, I think. I might have got that wrong. It's around about then, and the Local Government Association lobbied successfully to remove that cap, and I think is late last year it was removed. Now any local authority with housing stock can borrow what they want to build new homes, and there's other grant funding that goes into building council homes from the government, and then there's other ways of funding it. So in Haringey they've got a £1 billion programme to fund new council housing, and now there isn't much detail on this fund, and bizarrely it says it's only going to build 400 homes, which is terrible value. But so,
for £1 billion.
Yeah, I again, there was a huge lack of detail in this. Right. I think it was just part of the fund, but it was around 400 million for 400 homes, which is again terrible value. But this goes on to my next point. To be a house builder, you need a lot of skills, a lot of experience, and a lot of expertise. So, if local authorities haven't built homes at the scale we are envisaging, say 10 or 50,000 a year for the past 3 decades, why on earth do we think they're going to be able to do it all of a sudden in the next few years? Yeah. It's very difficult to build a home. They need to be able to buy land. They need to kind of manage costs, to commission good architects, and then be able to manage that stock. And they don't have all of those skills. It takes time, and there's only so many people with those skills in this country. There aren't enough of them. There aren't enough there are not enough construction workers either. So the idea that councils are going to build our way out of the housing crisis in 10 or even the next 20 years is bizarre. It's not going to happen, I'm afraid. Even if I agree, I think it'd be great if it happened, but it won't. So we've got to start from that position. I think if the numbers increase to 3,000, or if they increase by 1,000 every year, then, or hopefully more than that, then great. But it's a long-term thing, and it was completely wrong, I think, of the government to kind of place that block on new councils building. But it's going to take a long time for that to work again.
Well, obviously now we don't have the same. But I think you're absolutely right to say that councils aren't able to do it anymore. They've lost the knack effectively because they're not used to it. And also we used to have loads of local authority architects departments. One of the best of which was Hampshire County Council Architects, where I'm from, who did had a chief called Colin Stansfield Smith, I think, who did some wonderful schools in particular, one of which I actually went to. Really, really well designed buildings. But they're sort of one of the few that's remaining. There are almost no architects departments within councils left anymore. And that, I guess, that's part of losing the knack, the ability to commission, like you say, commission buildings, commission architects, do all the necessary things. So given that's the case, do you think we have to sort of accept that and go for a kind of different model that works more with the private sector, as it now is, with private practices of architects, private developers or private builders, and redesign the model so councils don't have to do all the work again themselves, but they can collaborate effectively and do it to the same degree, but through a different model and with more involvement of the private sector?
Yeah, I think there are lots of local authorities have faced massive budget cuts since 2010. I think their budgets have been reduced by about 40% on average. So they've been forced to innovate and think about things differently. And a few councils have set up local housing companies which operate outside of the normal council, so they're not bound by the regulations that government sets them. And in that regard, they have been partnering with the private sector. They've also, local authorities own a hell of a lot of land, often in very useful locations. Often it's completely useless for housing. You wouldn't want to put housing on it because often it's roads or parks or anything like that. You don't housing should never go on there. But they have a lot of brownfield land redundant land that could have housing on it. So they've been looking at these assets that they have and are thinking far more imaginatively about it. But in terms of different models, yeah, I hope they emerge. They are emerging already. But again, local authorities, they have so many budgetary pressures. The idea that they're suddenly become major house builders in this country. I mean, if you ask someone who worked at Barratt or Persimmon or Bovis or Taylor Wimpey, who build, tens of thousands of homes, or not 10 or 15,000 homes a year, whether a local authority could do that when they're facing all of those other issues, then they would probably laugh at the idea. It's not that they wouldn't want to do it. So we've got to look at other ways of building homes. So housing associations are good at doing this. A lot of them haven't built recently in the future, but lots of them are looking to do it. They have access to quite a lot of money and a lot of goodwill from the public as well, because they're obviously non-profit. And then there's also something that we at Policy Exchange are looking at the moment, is the idea of what businesses can do in terms of intervening in the housing market on behalf of their employees. So if you think back to something like Port Sunlight or Bourneville, these are all, what's the one in Bradford? Saltaire. It's not sure if it's in Bradford. But when these kind of Methodist owners of factories have seen that their workers are living in horrible conditions, horrible slum housing, and they've intervened on behalf, and they've built these homes, and really good quality homes. And if you go to these places now, they look amazing. Obviously, we don't have people living in slums, but there is a case, and some companies are already for building homes or commissioning the building of homes for their employees. Often they'll intervene in the housing market in different ways by providing, say, a rental bond, like a deposit, or kind of somehow, subsidising their travel or something like that, so they can live closer to their home. But basically, there's now a business case for staff recruitment and staff retention for businesses to, we think, to directly commission new homes for their staff, and in terms of renting for their staff. And so something we're looking at is how would this work across the country and across different industries. So Deloitte, for instance, have bought some homes in the Olympic Village where they rent it out to kind of graduates that have just moved to London to work at Deloitte. And now these are temporary propositions. Like they're not going to live there for longer than a year, I don't know. But we're looking at how can that work on a bigger scale, in the way that we have key worker housing for NHS staff, police staff, other public sector workers. Can we have a private sector version of that? But given that private sector has, a lot of companies own a lot of land, maybe homes could go on that. We don't really think about it that way anymore. And we're not saying like that Dyson should start building homes. I'm not saying that Deloitte should build any homes or that a farmer should build homes, but can they work with private sector developers or housing associations who do know how to contract the building of homes to do that?
Yeah, well, sure. The sort of immediate counter argument to that comes to mind is surely if these companies just paid them living wages to match local living costs, then they wouldn't need to have the interventionist approach of providing them with housing directly, because they could have enough money to have the choice to live locally wherever they wanted. Wouldn't that be a better way to give people the choice and enable them to live locally?
Yes.
Rather than just paying them a decent wage, rather than
that doesn't
providing them with houses. It
would, but where we see this being important is where there's a lack of supply in the housing market.
Right.
So whether that is in the centre of London, or it might be in a rural community where there just isn't enough homes or isn't enough high quality homes. And going back to like some of that Dyson, they have their campus in Wiltshire, I think. And okay, if they want to, I know they're moving to Singapore, but let's forget that for the moment. If they wanted to expand that campus, how do they know that the local housing market is going to be able to house their extra staff who probably want quite high quality housing, because I imagine they're quite well paid? And what could James Dyson do to build homes for the people on that campus? So this is not going to be a solution to the housing crisis. It's just having a bit of additionality where some people think councils are going to build, but why don't we try and get more people building and seeing how land can be used differently, and whether people have expertise and assets that we can use differently.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely an interesting model. I mean, you mentioned farmers. Obviously, it's been pretty typical for farmers to build rural housing, and there's specific planning provisions for farm workers or land workers or anything. But it's interesting thinking about this sort of worker-based model, because it goes back to almost the Industrial Revolution, doesn't it? Where you've got a large employer in a town, or even a large employer that effectively creates the town by setting up there and then building all the houses and bringing the people in. But isn't that almost quite optimistic, given how many towns there are where the employer is now left, and you've got all these people who live in these houses through no fault of their own, now don't have employers to work for in their towns. So wouldn't it be better to try and effectively repopulate the places that have been abandoned by businesses with new businesses, rather than creating new sort of campuses in London and the South East?
Sure, but I mean, I would always go back to the fact that people want to live in certain places, and that's unlikely to change for 50 or 100 years. And so in London, lots of people want to live in London and in the towns around the southeast. That is where our housing supply problem tends to be, in terms of where we need more supply. We have housing supply problems in places like Liverpool and Sunderland, but it's not about adding the number of homes, it's about improving the quality of those existing homes. So I take your point, and I think, yes, that is a good thing to aim for, and I think government, that's why they've introduced an industrial strategy to think about those things, but that doesn't stop us thinking about how businesses can, businesses in areas of high housing demand can intervene on behalf of their staff. And the most famous example of this is 10 Downing Street and 11 Downing Street. If the Prime Minister gets a home delivered by their employer, and the Chancellor too, then why can't I? I mean, I don't really want politicians building homes. They're probably too small to do it. But you might have.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned size. That this would obviously be a large business thing, really, wouldn't it? Has the sort of the employment market changed too much now? We don't have that many of these great big employers anymore. But it is all more broken up, and there's more people working independently or working as freelancers or as consultants or whatever it is. Even if they're working in sort of technical or manual jobs, they often don't work for large employers. So does that model work now, given that the change in the employment market?
Well, there's no reason why companies can't work together on this and commission together. Again, this is something that we're looking at, and we're going to be researching for the next few months. So I will tell you in a few months if that's all right. But yeah, we're looking at the different models by which this might work. We don't know. Maybe people don't want to live in homes provided by their employer. This is something that we're going to ask people via some public polling. Yeah.
Well, the other immediate analogy that comes to mind is I had quite a few friends who were in the RAF, and they get supplied with housing on bases, of course, most of which was reasonable quality from what I've heard, although not necessarily always the case. And they were sort of, that was just sort of accepted as standard. But it's sort of different because you've got the security implications and all that kind of thing, and you're inside of a fence a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it's an interesting sort of psychological thing in terms of, would people feel too overly connected to their employer if their employer was providing their housing? Is it almost like being, I don't know, being in a boarding school where you're living and working in the same place? Or
maybe, but I mean, we don't see this as a solution for all kinds of every part of society. I think my starting point is it's probably for young people who are moving to London or to Liverpool or to Manchester for a job, for their first job, and they have no idea what they're doing. They don't know where they're going to live. And I remember when I went to university in London, but even after living here for 3 years and coming back to work here, I was kind of a bit terrified by where on earth am I going to live? I'm not really sure. And then my brother's just moved here, and he's had quite a lot of difficulty finding somewhere. And if your employer can actually help in that process, then I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Again, the other thing that's sort of more of a new model is the idea of cooperative housing. And I mean, you talk about sort of young people and young professionals. This is sort of the sort of London-centric view of the world coming out. But there are more models of co-living spaces, effectively, being constructed with different financial models. Can a work-based, almost live-work model fall into that, where you have a co-working, co-living space provided by an employer, even if it's maybe even just one apartment block?
It could work well for some people. There was a report earlier in the week by the Social Market Foundation which talks about co-living, and I think there is a segment of the population who would be willing and wanting to live in somewhere like that, but I think they're quite a small part. So, but again, like, we have key worker housing, provides NHS staff, police staff, a home where they wouldn't otherwise not be able to work, and if they didn't have that home, they'd have to commute 2 hours, or I don't know, like far too long to get to their job, and they can't do their job properly. They're not living their life to the fullest. It's impacting their well-being. Can we translate that attitude into the private sector? A private sector which is increasingly kind of accused of the kind of crony capitalism, stuff like that. They're looking for ways to help their workers beyond just talking about corporate social responsibility, whatever that is. And this is something that we think might be quite good. I have no idea. It might not work. It might be a terrible idea, but it's worth exploring. And again, it goes back to your earlier question about local authorities. If local authorities can add, say, 10,000 extra per year to this, to how many we build per year, how many homes we are built per year, okay, businesses can add 10,000 to that, and then we're slowly getting to the target of 300,000 homes per year.
Yeah, I mean, it's you've written a lot about localism as well. I think 'cause you used to work for Localism.
Yes,
the think tank. Like it's interesting to me about how these sort of conversations coming up about more local engagement in planning terms and in architecture. But does that apply on a more general political level as well? Is there, moving more to the sort of political side of things, is there potential greater role for local involvement or local government in a more general sense?
People being more engaged in local government, as in...
Well, yeah, I mean, or greater devolution from national government to local authority, to local governments.
Yes, absolutely, on some things. I think the tide of... Sorry, that's a horrible way of describing it, but the movement of powers in the past few years has been to city regions, and I think that's a good thing, because it's a good geography to plan your economy and your housing market and stuff like that, and transport. If you just gave, so if the government decided actually we're going to devolve powers around transport, housing, planning to, say, Barnet Borough Council instead of the Greater London Authority, then I don't think that you wouldn't get the same. It wouldn't work as well. You wouldn't have London, this kind of cohesive unit. I wouldn't be able to get from one end of London to the other for about £3 or whatever it is. So yes, in answer to your question, we should be devolving more power down to people, but it's important to get it to the right scale. So we've also gone to more powers have gone to Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Bristol City region, whatever that might be. They're very clunky names, and people don't immediately identify with these areas, but these are the right units at which to plan and for government to devolve powers to. Also, government's got to have rightly trust that when you give people power and responsibility and extra funding, that there's going to be one leader who's going to be responsible for it, and they're going to be of a high quality. If you do that to 326 local authorities, there will definitely be some bad eggs in there. So if we can do it to 6 or 7 kind of regional mayors, then I think that's a good thing. I think there should be far more mayors, by the way.
Well, you mentioned the fact that most people want to live in the London and the southeast. And I've long sort of believed that one of the main problems we have in this country is we only have one megacity, effectively. There's no competitor to London. Unlike almost any other developed nation, we have just one great big city and no competitors to that, not 2 or 3 or 4. And that so long as that is the case, London will always be sucking more and more and more of the life out of the rest of the country. It's a horrible way to put it, and that you need, in order to address that, the only way to address that is to have a proper competitor to London, effectively. And so having things like HS2 and that are just going to effectively suck more into London rather than taking more out of London. Do we need to do much more in terms of developing the other cities and city regions to be a genuine competitor to London?
Well, you don't make the other cities better by making London worse. That's my starting point. And I mean, yes, it would be good if there were other cities that were bigger. There's I think it's called Zipf's law, where there's this idea where in every country you have a massive city, then it reduces by 2 and it reduces by 2, and it's a
Pareto distribution, isn't it? Where you've got
that's the one. Yeah, much better. And we don't follow that in this country, and it's quite odd. And but I mean, that is the, and it would be nice if that was the case, and that's why these mayors were created. These regional mayors like Andy Street, Andy Burnham. I can't remember the names, so they don't have as much public profile. But and you can in the national media, you can see that they had these places suddenly have a voice. And Andy Burnham is always going on about, I don't know, something like homelessness or why the government's failing on this thing or the other thing, and that's a good thing. The government might not like it, but suddenly you've got someone speaking for your area, and I think that's a really important thing, and why I think more places should be able to have these mayors. And government has really strict principles on the kind of people, like the kind of arrangements by which they would devolve power. And as I said, that's important, but it also means you can't devolve power to a lot of rural areas. And as someone who's brought up in the countryside, I quite like there to be a mayor of Suffolk, actually, or maybe not mayor of. It might have to be a bit bigger than that.
Well, it's an interesting sort of change from having a sort of single figurehead rather than just the head of the council. Because I think you're right, it does sort of increase accountability because you know that there's one figurehead who's sort of leading the strategy of the area or the city. Do you think, I mean, in places like New York and America and other sort of cities around the world, mayors have much more power in terms of laws, and we can have different, not quite a federal structure, but almost. Do you think that would be a good thing, or would that be too dangerous to do in this country?
I think their biggest. Well, no, I would like to see us move in that direction. So in London, 5% of taxes raised go locally, and 95%. Just generally go back to the exchequer, back to central government. In New York, I think it's around half and half, and again in Paris, it's maybe, I'm not sure about Paris, but in other places, we should be moving towards that kind of situation, I think. And also letting people have more of a say over how their money's spent. There's lots of interesting ideas from councils controlled politically on the left and on the right around giving citizens more of a say over how money is spent. So maybe we could have a referendum in London on spending more on architecture. More. You were talking about local authority architecture departments. Why don't maybe people in London care about it so much that they'd be willing to spend £2 extra per month to fund this department that advises, I don't know, like all of these London boroughs. I don't know, but we don't even have that conversation in the UK. Whereas in Los Angeles, they have a massive homeless problem, and what was it? Los Angeles, and they had a referendum on increasing the sales tax by 0.5% to fund homelessness services in the city. The referendum was supported by lots of people and by businesses as well, and it passed with a stonking majority. And they have raised the taxes, and there are going to be more services provided to homeless people as a result. Yet we don't even think about that kind of thing in this country. So any any way that we move towards that kind of system, I think is good. I see why people are nervous about it, and it's also very, like, a lot of politicians will say in opposition, oh yeah, we need to devolve more power to people, give people more power, and then they get into government and they actually think, actually, I quite like having this power. I don't want to give it to you, Andy Burnham, or you, Sadiq Khan. And we've seen this with, say, Chris Grayling, who, as Transport Secretary, was blocked the devolution of powers on the London Overground line in South London to Sadiq Khan, even though it was recommended by the former Chancellor George Osborne. So how on earth we get to that point where we have a more federalised structure? Well, I suppose that's a different thing to cities, but with cities having more powers and kind of rural areas having more power, it would be we're reversing a long tide of centralisation in this country. It's going to take a long time to push it back.
Well, would people really stand for having sort of regular local referendums on things? Like,
I don't know.
Judging by recent history, I think people are most generally pretty sick of being asked stuff. Isn't that too close to direct democracy?
Well, I think the best way of doing it, I mean, to be honest, maybe local referendum isn't the best thing. Maybe we actually elect our councillors, or when we elect our county councillor, maybe we're not electing county councillors, we're actually voting for we're voting for their programme. We know what, say, the leader of Essex County Council is going to do. What are they offering? What are the Conservative or the Essex or the Labour grouping for each council offering? And they, like we have a manifesto for central government, and it's a big event in a general election.
Well, sure, that's what we do already, isn't it?
It is, but it is. But we have more radical ideas, and it becomes more interesting. And
right.
So policy would vary much more by place, and maybe people wouldn't like that. I don't know, but I quite like the idea of it, and it would, you have, so a good example is in Greater Manchester. There's a big homelessness problem. If Andy Burnham says in his next mayoral election, I'm going to raise the council tax precept, the mayoral council tax precept by 10p or £1 or whatever, to fund homelessness services across the city region, then that's a good way of doing it. It doesn't need to be a referendum. And but he probably wouldn't say that, because he probably, I don't know, maybe he would. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we're sort of delving deep into local authority reform and local government reform, which is a fairly large political agenda, I suppose. Yeah,
and probably one they don't want to touch with a barge pole because it's so controversial.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine. What was that rant from was it Yes Prime Minister, where Sir Humphrey was ranting about local government not having too much power, and what happens if the wrong people or the right people don't have the power, the wrong people get it.
Oh god,
you end up with local government. I don't know. But no, it's an interesting idea. It's certainly more sort of, I suppose, more democratic. But then, like we are experiencing now the problem with direct democracy, or greater direct democracy. So is the sort of the counter argument is, like, we already have elected representatives. We already elect people and councillors and MPs to make those decisions on our behalf. Like, they should be doing a better job of representing their constituents, really, shouldn't they? Like, if that system was functioning properly, then we wouldn't need that much more local involvement.
I'd say the system as it is currently set up, with power centralised in Westminster and Whitehall, you'll never have a system that's responsive enough to places' individual needs or people's individual needs. That's why it's important to give people as much power in their lives to live their life as they want to, give them as much opportunity as possible. And it's also why it's important to give local authorities and, kind of places as much power as possible to choose how they want, how open or closed they want to be to globalization, things like that, or if they want to do things differently. So a good example is in the Tees Valley. The mayor, whose name I cannot remember, he wants to have special regulatory framework for the port, basically to operate outside whatever customs union or other we end up in after the Brexit negotiations. He wants to have special status in the Tees Valley because it's a deprived area, and he wants to attract as many businesses as possible. And apparently the Treasury is interested in this idea that you can have, a tailored regulatory framework, and that opens up loads of ideas. So, I mean, I was brought up my mum used to live near Clacton in Essex, and it's quite unlikely at the moment that a business is going to rush to go and locate in Clacton, but maybe there's stuff that government can do about tailoring some kind of regulatory framework to attract businesses there. Maybe they don't want to do that. Maybe, I don't know. It's worth thinking about things in this way. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they don't pay attention to regulatory frameworks. They just want to locate in London because that's where people live, and that's where they're going to get the staff who want to work there. Maybe they just want to locate there because it's London. It's this global city. But it's worth asking the question.
Yeah, it's definitely. We're sort of delving into large social changes on these sort of policies, aren't we? But going back to the sort of the housing problems and the sort of the regionality of those problems, I think it was Sky News did a very good analysis late last year about the sort of different aspects in different countries, different parts of the country. But is there more of a emphasis that needs to be had on almost relocating people? Obviously not in a forced way, but incentivizing people to move to places where there are an abundance of houses, rather than or from places where there are shortages, so i.e. mostly from London and the southeast to the rest of the country, effectively. Would that be more productive and a better solution rather than just ranking up production in one area and ignoring it in another area?
I think on the housing, on that Sky News piece, it was a good piece, and I've always thought when we talk about national housing crisis, it doesn't make sense because it varies so much. There are so many different local housing markets in the UK and in England and in London. Like there are so many different housing markets in London, let alone the rest of the country. To talk about the housing crisis as a national thing is completely wrong because everyone experiences the housing market differently. And like the housing crisis to me would be different to the housing crisis to you as it would be to my mum. Like it's so to talk about it in regional terms and to understand, as we said earlier, like actually, well, we'll get into this in a second, but the idea that we need more homes in London and around the southeast, and we need to improve the stock in some places, or improve the rental offer in some places, or improve the design and style of some of these places because they're pig ugly. Some towns that have just been kind of ruined by 1960s planners and architects. I'm exaggerating, but so it really is varied, and it's a lack of affordable housing. It's so varied that to say we have a national housing crisis, again, that's what Policy Exchange's work is trying to be get towards, and again at Localis as well when I worked there, that's what we're trying to be pushed towards. That there are very, very many different solutions to this. It's not just about hitting 300,000 new homes a year. It's about building nice homes that people want to live in and in the places where they are needed. So on your question, to be honest, I instinctively disagree with you. I don't like the idea of I'm not saying you're saying we should be forcibly repatriating people to where they came from, but
no, I'm not saying that.
We live in an open liberal country where the idea of we have a freedom of movement within our country, and I would really hope that never changes. I don't envisage it ever change.
Well, I mean, the things that come to mind are things like HS2 being built from London upwards rather than from the north downwards, and abandoning, spending 50 billion on that rather than spending half that much on transport links between the northern cities, which would make vastly more difference, and all the sort of the shifting of priorities effectively.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really know much about HS2, but instinctively I agree with you. And back to the kind of the point about power at city levels, we should let Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region use their own tax base to raise the money, or to borrow against their tax base to borrow that to get the finance to pay for these new infrastructure. We shouldn't have to rely on central government to say yes or no. So Crossrail, half of it was funded by the GLA. The reason London has better infrastructure is because London has one of the reasons London has better infrastructure is because it has more powers to raise money to build that, and of course they have a much wider, bigger tax base. But the powers thing is really important. So when they're trying to fund Crossrail 1, there was a levy on business rates, and it was there for 10 years or something, and it raised I think like a third of the money. And so you can't do, I think you can now do that in Greater Manchester, but we haven't, most places have been constrained in doing that. But going back to should people be able to, yes, we should try and make places better and make people want to live and kind of stay in the place where they went to university or where they were brought up and feel like they can make a contribution there and have a job there. However, the economic reality of our country is such, and it's probably likely to worsen, is that London is the kind of the Death Star of the economy, where it sucks everything in. And it's a nice idea to kind of reverse that, but I just think we have to work with what we have at the moment, and there really is a desperate housing shortage in London, and my personal view is that we need to make London bigger, not bigger that way, but bigger, expand it. We have these bizarre regulations that prevent us building on the edge of London. We have the edge of London, or Greater London boundaries were set in 1963, I think, and we haven't looked at them since. They've been very tiny changes. But why? Okay, why are we having our planning rules dictated? But like, why are we accepting that is how it should be? We also have the planning system, which was introduced in 1947. Like it protects people's property wealth, particularly people who live in green, leafy parts of the southeast. Like, it's the biggest socialist thing left in our economy, and it protects the people that tend to vote Conservative. It tends to protect their property value, and so they're the people who love this socialist planning system. Whereas we, the kind of the millennial youth who are supposedly socialists, we never talk about I don't know, we never talk about it in those terms. Like the idea that hello,
throw her off if you want to.
That's all right. It's not me off my
socialist planning policy.
Yes, no, it's just this bizarre thing where when they talk about socialism for the old, capitalism for the young. I'm not saying like one is better than the other or whatever, but like we don't talk about it in these terms. Like this socialist planning was introduced in 1947 protects people's property wealth, and no one seems to see this. We need to, in a way, I mean, if I could go very Liz Truss about this, but fight back against that kind of attitude, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought this up, because I think I disagree with you on pretty much everything.
Good.
In that. I mean, in terms of sort of the green belt and the expansionism, one of the things that I'm always glad of every time I go to especially Northern Europe is the fact that we do have green belt policies, because in places like the Netherlands and in large parts of Germany, you get every town just bleeds into the next one, and you get an expansion of development along roads and arterial routes, and then it sort of gradually gets a little bit less dense and then more dense, and you're in the next town, then less dense. But you can barely tell that you've left one place and entered another. You just need to look at a satellite image to tell this. And when you I always think when you fly into Gatwick and you see especially at night, and you see the absolute carpet of darkness populated by a few dots of settlements, rather than this mass expanse of light everywhere. To me, that's a perfect example of the green belt and the planning system working well to stop sprawl, which is the problem they've had in America. And from an architectural point of view, and from a sort of urban planning point of view, the way I can't remember, Nick Boy-Smith talks about this with Create Streets a lot. Densification is absolutely key, and that when you densify places, you create a better intensity of life, of vibrancy in a city, and within the sort of the 1 mile walkable zone. If you densify that's how you create a good functioning workable settlement, as they've been doing in places like Italy for centuries. Whereas if you allow the urban sprawl to happen effectively, that it will happen, and then you end up people having to drive everywhere and having to build tram links and having to have buses going all over the place and always trying to ship people in and out all the time. Whereas having a local base where you're within a mile of where you work and you can walk there or cycle there, or you can live within a local zone effectively, rather than having to commute for 50 miles on the train or even commute by car for 5 miles.
I agree. That sounds good.
But my point is that if you allow even as somebody with sort of who generally agrees with a lot of the more free market libertarian stuff, if you allow that on a sort of planning level, you end up with a free for all that ultimately results in negative outcomes for everybody, which is exactly what happened in America, where they're like, no rules, build what you want, wherever you want, for as far as you like, and you end up with these miles and miles and miles and miles of urban sprawl that then result in traffic issues 50 years later.
So I wouldn't advocate that. I would advocate selective release of large sites on the greenbelt, kind of crap greenbelt, to build very high quality, beautiful developments, and we will release that land on the condition that it is built beautifully in ways that the public like, that it provides a high amount of affordable housing. And because the land, developers would, or whoever owns that land would have bought it with very little, they wouldn't have thought it would be developed, because they would have had greenbelt regulations, so they would have paid for quite a lot. They wouldn't have paid that much for the land, relatively speaking. Okay, if we're going to change the regulation on that land and let you develop on it, then you're rather than just saying you're going to make all of that as in profit, we're going to say no, you've got to build to a high quality, and you're going to provide that affordable housing and that discounted home ownership to millennials or something like that. And that's again, we'll go back to the start of this conversation. It's how we see the housing conversation changing in this country, that actually not all land is sacred and not all of it should be protected from development. And actually there are some conditions that if you meet those conditions, you can develop that land. And you can achieve all of the things you're just talking about. Again, if you just take selective parts of land, I'm not just saying, not just like a kind of, if you have one town there and one town there, and we just say, oh, we'll build along that bit. But rather, if you've got a link kind of, you can get from Euston to Watford in 18 minutes. That's quicker than I can get from Euston to some of the places on the Northern Line. So parts of London, or parts of the southeast, are actually closer to London than parts of London are to Leicester. That makes no sense. But
yeah, I know what you mean. It's travel time, isn't it? Yeah.
We should take advantage of all this new infrastructure, including HS2 and Crossrail 1 and Crossrail 2 if it ever gets built. And my thought is, and it's quite Victorian in a sense, that we should just be building and taking advantage of these areas, and again setting very high conditions for what is built, but allowing it to be built. Let's relieve some of the pressure in the London housing market and let people live in these areas. And I mean, when you fly into Gatwick or to Stansted, it would look different, but it wouldn't be places bleeding into each other. You'd set the highest standards of development to achieve the kind of the principles you just set out.
No, I completely agree that in certain circumstances there is definitely an argument for releasing greenbelt land. I mean, I used to live in Canterbury, and they're just about to start a brand new 4,000 house development or something in the fields just to the south of the city, because they've made that strategic decision that that's a good idea. So, and in certain circumstances with the right quality, it is, I think, the right thing to do. My general argument against that, especially in London, is that you have to pick off the low-hanging fruit first, and the amount of brownfield land, of land over transport links, of reuse sites, of redevelopment sites, of densification, the amount of that you can do before you have to even touch any greenbelt land is absolutely enormous. And if you do that first, you then help those areas that you are densifying by increasing the amount of footfall traffic, increasing the population, like increasing the amount of vibrancy, before you even have to go near any extra urban sprawl in a lot of cases. So
the problem with the brownfield land point, I agree in principle, brownfield first, but so when you have institutions, organisations rather, like the campaign to protect rural England, saying we can build there's 1 million homes that can be on brownfield land out there. Most brownfield land by definition is land that is developed upon, and that is, I mean, the land we're sitting on at the moment is brownfield land. It includes roads, it includes all sorts of things, and I'm not saying that most people think we can build on all brownfield land, but the idea that there's this kind of a huge amount of land out there, especially in London, that can be built upon, is just it's not as true as people think it is. And particularly there aren't many large brownfield sites left in London. Basically, if we want to contain all of London's growth within those boundaries I was talking about, or within the built-up area, we're going to have to make some very difficult decisions on where does industry what do we prioritize, industry or homes. So there is a planning designation in the London plan called strategic industrial land or something like that. Basically, it's land that's protected. You can't build homes on it, and it's a policy of the mayor at the moment to protect that land. But okay, and he also says we're going to protect all the greenbelt in London. Okay, where are we going to put, and then we get into quite difficult conversations about where we put new homes if we're ever going to achieve his target of 66,000 new homes per year, which, by the way, the MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, think is far too low, and so the London School of Economics, I think it should be around 100,000 new homes per year. So we're not identifying anywhere near enough land to come forward in London for new homes, and I agree we should look at brownfield sites first, but we should definitely not close off greenfield sites in the way that the current system does.
Well, I think it's not, I mean, obviously there's sort of a stereotype as to what brownfield land actually is. And I think there's more so than sort of existing brownfield sites, there's even more of a role for densification of in-use sites, as opposed to sort of the idea of a brownfield site as like a derelict site that needs developing but had something once. The idea of actually taking somewhere that has low density but functional housing, and it densifying it effectively, or allowing it to be densified through planning policies, is a much better one. That if you're a developer and you buy a 3-story Georgian block, say, that you can actually make it a 5-story Georgian block, or a 5-story nicely designed contemporary block, or whatever it is. That you, by that means, you then really gradually densify the city. You end up with somewhere like sort of mid-rise areas, and that's the sort of the best way to increase numbers, is by that densification around existing transport links and around existing infrastructure, rather than trying to create new nodes further out. And I'm not saying there's not a role for that. There is sometimes, but the intensification of existing areas which are crying out for investment sort of kills two birds with one stone, more so than sort of shipping out and ignoring the areas as they are now, and taking the development and the prosperity and putting it elsewhere.
I guess it's a boring answer, but we need to do both, really. I mean, the extent of the housing crisis, housing supply problem in London is so big that we have to really go at this in many different ways. And the problem with the draft new London plan, so the London plan that the mayor's put together recently, it closed off so many options, and he set the highest housing target ever, but then closed off many different ways of doing it. So he wants so Steve Carney wants to build a lot more houses in suburban sites and small sites, densifying as well, and that's good. And we should be doing that, but we should also be doing lots of different other things. And I mean, Politics Change is going to be publishing research on this quite soon, to be honest. We got a report which is imminent, making the case around this. So yeah.
So in terms of, one of the things I talked about with Paul Finch was about the idea of housing as infrastructure, and of thinking of housing and housing development as a sort of a national infrastructural project, rather than as this sort of private sector thing that goes on separately. What's your sort of opinion of viewing it that way? And do you think there's a greater or lesser role for stronger compulsory purchase powers in certain very specific circumstances to sort of enable that more easily?
So there's planning, basically, sorry. You could include housing as nationally significant infrastructure, and that would make planning a lot easier. It would also mean government, in the way that happened with HS2, just saying that is going there, we don't care what you think about it. And that is a very I suppose an attractive way of doing things, because it solves the NIMBYism issue, because we don't listen to NIMBYs anymore and we don't care what they think suddenly. And I mean, it's quite a almost like a Chinese way of doing things, that we just put it there because that's for the good of the country. And again, that's an attractive idea, and there is a policy framework for doing that, but it'd just be very contentious to treat housing that way politically, and I don't think that would ever get through any parliament, to be quite honest, because it just means it would give the government so much power to put housing where it wanted. And again, that is quite a nice idea, but I think in practice politically it's quite difficult. And compulsory purchase powers, that sounds like a good idea. Like the state intervening more in the land market is a good idea, because the land market is entirely dysfunctional in terms of delivering kind of land where it's needed at the price that would allow the building of beautiful, affordable new homes. If the state can intervene in that in a more interventionist way, I think that is a good thing in a targeted way. And the thing is, it already has the powers to do this. It's always had the powers to do this. Local authorities can do it. It's really expensive, and it's a really risky process, because you are taking you're taking a landowner, you're almost like expropriating what they think is the value of their land. I mean, I think they're wrong, but it's a really politically contentious thing to do, and that clearly the politics on this has moved in the past year or two, thanks to Shelter, another think tank called Civitas, lots of other people being putting their weight behind this idea that we should be intervening much more in the land market. It's a really difficult and contentious thing, and what the nub of it seems to be that they want to change things about the legal, the law around what is a hope value and what is use value, and what can the landowner expect to get from their from the land. Should it just be the existing use value? So if it's just a farming field, it should just be the value of a farming field, and they get a small premium because they've been, they've lost out on a few things, and it's caused a bit of a nuisance to their lives. Or should they get the full hope value of whether of what the value of that land could be? And there seems to be, so I was speaking to a QC about this about a few months ago, and he said he thinks there's some kind of confusion in this because in how people interpret the law. He thinks at the moment actually we're far closer to the idea that you can take, when you compulsory purchase a plot of land from someone, the amount that is paid for it tends to be closer towards the existing use value rather than the hope value. And the government has introduced legislation recently to kind of facilitate that. But the arguments of organisations like I talked about tends to be actually it's more towards hope value. So we're getting into very
Well, no, I think I'm sort of inherently against or opposed to the idea of compulsory purchase as someone who sort of believes in the freedom of individuals to exist without being corralled by the state into doing things. But I think if you're going to do it, you should give people, say, twice whatever the market value is so that they're actually sort of given reasonable compensation, not only in terms of what it's worth, but in terms of the fact that you've basically stolen their property.
Yeah, I think to be honest, we've got to go back to what creates the value, or what dictates the value of a plot of land. It's normally what does the planning policy dictate can be built there. And so we'll go back to my field in the green belt, which is crap and it's being farmed and it's causing all kinds of damage to the field and the kind of the earth underneath it. As a farm on the green belt, there's no hope of developing on that land. You're not allowed to build on green belt land. Therefore, the value of that land is quite low. It's like £20,000 in a hectare or something like that. But if that green belt protection goes, it skyrockets. It becomes developable and the value increases. So. But the state makes that decision.
But surely you have to give people the value of the value it would get were it to be put on the market at the current time if nothing else changes. Because once you start saying hypothetically this might happen, or hypothetically we might build a supermarket or a shopping centre on this and it's going to be worth billions.
But if we move towards a system where the state says actually that land is developable, but on the condition that it is built to look like, I don't know, St. Paul's Cathedral, I don't know, to that kind of quality, and you're going to build homes at that price, you're going to provide 30% affordable housing, and there's going to be 30% private sale, 30% for rent, and blah, blah, blah. They then set the land value. But my point is that the land value is set by the planning policy largely. It's a major factor of it. So if government, either government kind of intervenes much more and says these are the exact things that you can build on that land, and then the land value is set by that, or they kind of get right out of the way and then they let the free market rip, I suppose. But that's actually what happens in the US. There's this model, the zoning model. They say you can build these so for building social housing, they say you can build social housing that has to be rented out at this price, and then it sets the land value, and it takes a lot of this adversarial part of the planning system away, and the land values are nowhere near as high because the land value will only ever be what can be built on it.
Well, again,
I'm really simplifying things, by the way.
No, it's fair.
Mainly because I don't understand it entirely.
Well, the zoning thing is, I personally think, is a very, very sort of failed and bad idea, because you're being the sort of the master of the destiny of the settlement effectively, rather than letting it have the sort of organic growth in whatever way it wants to. So what once was a Georgian row of houses might now be a set of offices, or might now be a school, or might be a university, or whatever it is. And I think it's more responsible to just allow people to build whatever they need to build or want to build in a particular place, to allow shops to turn into houses and houses to turn into shops and shops turn into offices and all these kind of things, and not say you can only build this here or you can only build that there, because then you get that like I say, organic spontaneity about suddenly there's a business hub over here, suddenly there's a whole load of tech firms who've set up in these row of cottages down here in rural Gloucestershire or something, or you've got these sort of dilapidated old shop fronts which no one's occupying have suddenly been turned into affordable housing. So I'd be very, very wary of any sort of proper zoning in that respect.
Mhm.
And this is where I guess you come up against local plans and to what degree local plans should be authoritarian, effectively, and dictating what can and can't be done in particular places.
Well, don't tell a local authority planner that, because they protect that part, because they think they know what building can be built there, and we can only have a shop there because, you know, in 20 years time our forecast suggests that we're going to need a shop there. And it's this bizarre attitude that we hear that's ingrained through the planning use class system, and in some cases it's very good that, you know, you can't turn a shop into a waste disposal kind of unit. But in many cases, there's no reason why the state, you should have to apply for planning permission to change a shop into a home or something like that. And government is actually moving on that. And yeah.
So this work you're doing from the housing perspective that's coming out soon.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit more about what that's going to be.
Over the next year? Or
yeah, what have you got coming up?
Well, we've got a report coming out imminently in the next week or so, making the case for building new towns on the edge of London, or new places, which are well designed, beautiful, affordable, and discounted to millennials. We then have our work program is focusing on feeding into the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, looking at the practical ways that things could change. So we're looking at, could you have a objective definition of what is a good place, what do people like about a good place that could be useful to planning officers and how they make decisions. And I'm not just talking about aesthetics or anything like that, I'm just talking about, okay, does it bring jobs to an area, and like new things you can actually measure, and, you know, has there been community engagement in the process and stuff like that. We're also doing stuff on the idea of company housing, as I mentioned, and then beyond that we want to look at if we're building more homes and factories, how can we make sure that they look beautiful in a way, you know, and designs and styles that people like, because if you look at what is built in a lot of housing factories at the moment, it isn't of a high design quality, I'd say, and that's despite the fact it's being built by engineers, and if you give them a brief, they'll do it. So if you want a neo kind of classical house, they will do it, like built in a factory. There's no reason that we can stop this. I'm not saying we should build loads of neoclassical houses, I'm just saying if that's what people want. So how can you change the industry to provide people greater choice in that? We're looking at the kind of the economics behind building beautiful, whatever that is, like basically why are new homes built the way they are, what are the financial decisions behind that, why is it so easy to employ private capital in big tall lumpy buildings, like how is that going to change? Can it be easier to employ capital in, you know, terrace housing that people are built as kind of the kind of built environment that people actually like and prefer, and how does this work in a rural context? So as I said, I was brought up in a rural area. A lot of villages are very beautiful, a lot of them are very ugly. The one I was brought up in is quite ugly. So when we talk about building beautiful, it kind of tends to focus on London and other cities, but really the biggest crisis is actually in rural England, in my opinion, whether that's just building a new estate somewhere or if it's actually in a village. So how does this work in that area? And yeah, I'm sure there's other stuff too, but we're doing lots of events as well. So we're doing an event on the 19th of March with John Cruddas, MP for Dagenham and Rainford for the Labour Party, and Lord Maurice Glasman, who is a Labour peer, on beauty and socialism. So like kind of caring about the built environment is a tradition of it's always been a tradition of the left. As I said earlier, from Clement Attlee talking about building a new Jerusalem, Tony Crosland talked about what it was to live in a good society. John McDonnell even talks about, you know, creating beautiful environments. So how we're just going to ask, okay, how important is this tradition in the left Labour politics today? How can it change? How it tends to, there's kind of that romantic vision bumping up against utilitarian kind of Fabianism. So you have like your kind of William Morris on one side and your Sidney Webb on the other. And how is that battle happening in the Labour Party today? And so we're doing that on the 19th Policy Exchange. Then we've got all the other events as well. So,
and final question: given the Building Beautiful Commission sort of stemmed from your work largely, what would you like to see come out of it in a few months' time when Roger Scruton comes back with his report?
I think kind of like November or December. I don't think again, and yes, Policy Exchange was one influence in this debate. There are other ones like Create Streets, the Architects Journal with their campaign for more housing, better housing.
More homes, better homes.
More homes, better homes. Lots of people have campaigned for this. We were just, I don't know, I suppose it's a question of timing. That's why our kind of public exchange seems to be all over that kind of thing. What should come out of it? A set of practical recommendations to government and to industry about how to turn the industry around, really, how to make sure that the aesthetics and the design and style of new places is thought about a lot more. And they need to be practical, and I think they will be. I think people will be surprised by the commission, to be honest, because especially, to be honest, the commission doesn't need the approval of architects to be successful. It doesn't matter whether, I don't know, I can't remember these names of these architects. Owen Hatherley calls policy exchange fascistic, or if I can't remember the names of the other ones who criticise the commission. It doesn't matter what they think of it. It really doesn't. They are, well, one of them's a critic and one of them's just runs their own studio, or whoever these people, and it doesn't need their approval. And so how can it make architects relevant to volume house building again, or in a much better and in a better way? Yeah.
So presumably, you'd agree that it would be much more helpful if architects and the architectural profession got involved in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. The same way that policy exchange will feed into this commission, lots of other organisations should as well. So I'm sure the REBA are preparing something, and loads of places are, and loads of organisations are. It's good. Like, this is what we were hoping to do in our report, just provoke a conversation around the quality of what is built in this country and how it can improve and how it can look like people want. And we don't have all the answers. God, no, we don't. But somewhere out there, someone might. And if the one thing we've done is provoke that conversation, we've already succeeded.
Well, on that point, I can agree with you. Jack, Airey, thank you very much.
Cheers.